Hello and welcome to the presentation, Diversifying a Digital Platform, Expanding Alaska Native Collaboration and Engagement with Smithsonian Learning Lab. My name is Dawn Biddison, Museum Specialist at the Alaska Office of the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, part of the National Museum of Natural History. I have brown hair pulled back, I'm wearing glasses and a scarf because it's a little chilly here in Alaska this morning, and you're in a bedroom with artwork in the background. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the historic and present-day lands of the Dena'ina Athabascan people. I also want to thank the Alaska Native elders, scholars, knowledge keepers, artists, and educators who have collaborated with me on cultural heritage work since 2002. In this session, I'll be discussing a learning lab site built from new and existing work. The project goal was to increase access to resources for museum collections research and for museum fieldwork. I'd like to thank Tracy Spinelli, formerly of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, and now with the Office of the Undersecretary for Education, who trained me in how to use Learning Lab. And I'd like to thank Darren Milligan and Tess Porter, who continue to provide technical support through the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology. I also want to acknowledge the Smithsonian's Youth Access Grant Program, which funded the first phase of this work. Next slide, please. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, Learning Lab is an interactive educational platform created and hosted by the Smithsonian that is available for free for users and for creators. It has extensive online resources for learning how to use the site and live online tutorial sessions. Typical Learning Lab entries, like the two you see here on the right, are a single subject collection that utilize digitized resources available online at the Smithsonian, often part of a lesson created by a teacher. Next slide. But Learning Lab can be utilized in a more complex way to create an information-rich website utilizing groups of collections and multiple media that includes imported resources. The site I created on Alaska Native cultural heritage that you can see here on this slide has 4 categories of collections with 6 to 13 collections each, totaling 42 collections and up to 34 entries in a collection. The content is oriented to Indigenous peoples and also to educators, students, and lifelong learners. And the research documentation materials are texts, museum objects, photographs, illustrations, and videos. Next slide. The first phase of the Learning Lab site was based on research and the resulting exhibition, website, and book for Living Our Culture, Sharing Our Heritage, the First Peoples of Alaska, at the Smithsonian wing of the Anchorage Museum here in Alaska. All of the work was created in collaboration with Alaska Native elders, culture bearers, scholars, artists, and educators. After the exhibition opened in 2010, we continued working with Alaska Native communities on collaborative research, documentation, and education programs. These programs address the cultural priorities of their communities and also meet the goals of museums, which includes providing access to collections for Alaska Natives to facilitate shared research and fieldwork goals. Next slide. Our programs began with a focus on collaborative research and documentation of cultural heritage and languages, and with creating educational materials for their communities and for non-Native communities. Here you can see St. Lawrence Island Yupik elders, artists, and educators having fun demonstrating how to play with ivory bird game pieces, a set Marlin Kunuka pictured here, made that was very similar to the one behind them, collected for the National Museum of Natural History in 1926 from their island. Next slide. Work then shifted to art forms and materials that, as shared by Alaska Native colleagues, had few or no remaining practitioners to learn from, and that needed opportunities for elders, artists, knowledge keepers, and emerging artists to come together, to learn through studying museum collections and through fieldwork, to share and develop new techniques, and thereby build towards arts, reclamation, and revival. Given the imperative of cultural perpetuation and revitalization, all along, a goal of our work has been to increase dissemination and outreach. The steps we took from the start of our programs were to video document our research residencies, fieldwork, and workshops, and to produce in-depth educational videos within a cultural context, reviewed and approved by Alaska Native project participants, and then widely distribute the research through free DVDs. In this way, our work would have the chance to benefit more people across Alaska, the country, and across time. Next slide, please. The next step toward increasing outreach and community impact was to build a YouTube channel to foster additional access and finding of our project videos by putting them on a widely used platform. The channel includes 13 playlists that are made up of video sets for each of our research and fieldwork programs. YouTube has limitations, though, for the type of media that can be presented and is limiting when trying to keep content within its original context and within a set of broader materials. Next slide, please. And although YouTube can be used for education, it lacks elements for increasing accessibility through providing usage resources. For example, here, the work with Tsimshian red cedar basketry resulted in videos on the history of weaving in the region, how to harvest and process cedar, and details on how to weave their particular styles of basketry. But our work also included writing a bilingual guide in the endangered Tsimshian language of Shmaliuk, and finding a rare example of a twine basket from the one small Tsimshian community in Alaska in the collections of the National Museum of the American Indian, pictured lower right. Next slide, please. The goal of making accessible documentation an outcome of museum collections work led to another much better website platform for sharing work, Smithsonian's Learning Lab, and to building the site Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center in Alaska, shown here on this slide, along with the URL for finding the site. For the site, I developed 4 categories of collections to bring together in one place resources from the Living Our Cultures exhibition, website, and book, to our public programs, and to create new content for increasing Indigenous voices and representation of Indigenous cultural continuity and present-day lifeways. And given the restrictions of COVID-19, I also work to increase user accessibility by providing educational materials to use site resources for learning from home, as well as in a classroom. Next slide, please. In the section on Alaska Native cultures, the collections represent each of the 10 main cultures of Alaska and provide an essay written by an Alaska Native scholar from the exhibition catalog and a map of their territory from the exhibition itself. Both contemporary and archival photographs are included to bring community context to the museum collections and to represent cultural continuity and survival. Next slide, please. Heritage pieces in the Smithsonian's care are shared with updated information from source communities like the cultural name and object name, and much more information that focuses on in-depth knowledge from Alaska Native experts. And this is drawn from the exhibition website. And the information is presented in a way that's more accessible and more interesting to general audiences than the standard NMNH collection record. The elders' discussions are edited transcripts from research in the Smithsonian collections that was the basis of the exhibition. There are also curator-written historical summaries based on published materials written by both natives and non-native experts, and this was part of the exhibition catalog research. Next slide, please. The community videos section presents resources for learning about and practicing Alaska Native arts and languages from our collaborative programs once the exhibition opened, checked and approved by project partners. Subjects include processing and sewing moose hide, sea mammal intestines, salmon skin, and porcupine quills, as well as learning about the languages of St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Anubiac, and Dena'ina Athabascan peoples through museum objects. Next slide, please. The Learning Lab platform allows for resources to be kept in one place with more types of content than YouTube. Project photos, videos, heritage pieces at the Smithsonian, PDFs here of patterns for carving whistles, and links to additional resources. This particular collection also includes a troubleshooting video based on students' needs from virtual carving workshops that were held during COVID, and includes master Tsimshian artist and project lead John Hudson talking about whistles and other instruments in the Smithsonian collections, filmed through Zoom and then edited. Next slide, please. The distance learning section provides resources for teaching at home, at culture camps, or in a classroom. 5 come from prior work, and 5 new units were completed while working remotely and made in collaboration with Alaska Native cultural experts. 3 are for learning about Alaska Native languages and culture. 2 are interdisciplinary curriculum about Athabascan peoples and about salmon in Alaska. Next slide. And we'll take a quick look at one of the 5 new units, Alaska Native Design Parkas, to see ways the museum collection's information was improved by work done with Amy Topcock through an Indigenous Fellowship grant from the CIRI Foundation, an Alaska Native organization. The collection Amy and I worked on was an opportunity for me to mentor her on writing extended captions for photos she wanted to share, and on writing new text for archival photos with important updates, including one shown here, like improving the title and updating the home culture name, and more importantly, to include knowledge shared by elders and learned by Amy through her own research. Next slide, please. The collection was also an opportunity for her to interview skin sewers from her region by phone or through Zoom, including her aunt, and for me to mentor her on writing essays based on this research on Anubiac Parkas. We also worked on improving a guide she had written to teach on how to sew a cloth parka called a kespuk in the Yupik language and a tigluk in the Anubiac language. Next slide, please. I extended the Learning Lab site also during COVID to include a new collection for the 2021 webinar series Conversations. These were 6 webinars developed in collaboration and funded by the Inuit Art Foundation and included working with a group of Canadian and Inuit advisors online. These live moderated online discussions provide information and insights on topics important to Indigenous communities. They were recorded on Zoom and posted videos were edited from the 3 footage views. Next slide. The example shown here is about cultural appropriation versus appreciation. The discussion features 4 Alaska Native artists who work in different disciplines, but all face this ongoing issue and address the resulting problems with constructive approaches. The edited videos and additional information that Learning Lab allows you to provide along with the videos act as a resource for learning about Indigenous issues and to help prepare people for making choices about how to act with respect towards Indigenous peoples and their heritage. As I've demonstrated, and excuse me, next slide, please. This is the last slide. As I've demonstrated, and as you may have learned through your own work, museum research, fieldwork, and documentation can be shared more equitably and with more accessibility online through open use platforms like Learning Lab. And one person can do this work. I'm the one person that did this work. Since working at geographic distances between museum collections and home communities is an ongoing challenge, using digital platforms to share research outcomes will remain a vital way to increase equity and inclusion. And that's the end of my presentation. I tried to stick to that 10-minute time limit I was given. So if there's any questions, I'm available for answering those questions. The first question is, are there digitization needs that were identified? What collections will help by being digitized? So there's definitely digitization needs. In Alaska Native communities, there's a lot of recordings on audio cassette or other audio platforms that need to be digitized, transcribed, translated, or at least have descriptions written so that it enables and it facilitates access for Indigenous researchers and non-Native researchers. There's also more photos that need to be digitized in Alaska Native communities. And I also feel too, and have heard from people that I've worked with over time, that there needs to be more opportunities for Indigenous people, especially Alaska Natives, to have access to digital platforms and training in those digital platforms. One initiative through the University of Washington is Merkatu, and that's been successful for a few of the applicants to the program, but the program does require a pretty big time commitment, and there are a lot of calls on people's times. And so I've given a few presentations about Learning Lab just because I feel like it's a very user-friendly platform. It doesn't take too much training. And like I mentioned, they have online tutorials, and test porters are great help all of the time for people using the platform. And you immediately gain access to digitized resources through the Smithsonian. Platforms like Mercatu also offer, for organizations that participate in it, access to museum collection objects from other places. And one, good strength about Learning Lab is the Smithsonian has, of course, a really strong collections in Alaska and for other indigenous communities. And when you pull in those digitized records, you have the opportunity to write new text. So it really can reflect information that's important to, and that's known by indigenous community members that are creating these digitized records or these new digital collections online. And there's another question here. What have been the limitations when dealing with YouTube as a platform? So YouTube basically allows you to build a landing page. And in my case, I built a landing page and I sort of faked a place to put more information about the context of, our organization, the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, and about the projects that I was presenting. But all you can present is a very limited amount of text and videos, and people can pull up individual videos without necessarily finding the set of videos that they're a part of. So for my videos, they're in-depth videos that had interviews with artists, information about the communities, information about the museum collections, in addition to information about the materials and then the art practice. And it's important not to have one without those others, because the context is really important, and the indigenous values that are shared in these videos are really important to have all together. So, I would try to refer back in the title and in the text with each video that it's part of a set, but it isn't like a direct thing to find them within a set. And then, as I mentioned, what's important in terms of making videos like this more useful for educators. And just this morning, I got an email from someone who lives in Southwest Alaska in a fly-in only community called St. Mary's on the Yukon River, who asked me, were there any educational resources to go with the YouTube videos? So luckily I was able to direct her to the Learning Lab site, because unlike YouTube, I can't put a PDF with a lesson that can be downloadable on there. I can't put museum objects there with the detailed information that we have from the exhibition research that we did as part of the Living Our Cultures exhibition research. And that's really detailed information from community experts, some of whom have passed since that research was done starting in 2002. So, it's really important to have that in-depth information and that multidisciplinary information, because that's one of the strengths that museums have, is that they can offer that kind of information. It's the same kind of information that you would, dropping my phone with the questions on it. That's the same kind of information that visitors and audience go to museums for, is to get that really in-depth, rich, interdisciplinary information. And that's why they go to museum websites, for that higher level kind of information. And it looks like we have one more question here. How are you dealing with tribal knowledge limitations, e.g. for women or men only for making content available? When we worked on the exhibition, and when I put together these public programs, these research and fieldwork and residency and filming programs, we start from the very beginning by collaborating with Alaska Natives and Alaska Native artists and culture bearers and scholars. And so from the very beginning, we all talk together about, what is the subject we'll be talking about, what's appropriate for sharing publicly. And we also, have certain restrictions for the program that we did working with sea mammal intestine and ivory. The only workshop students could be Alaska Native, because due to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, only Indigenous peoples can work with these materials. So we make it really clear from the beginning when we're developing a project that, this information will be available to the public. And, but that said, during the course of filming, sometimes when people are being interviewed, or when I'm filming in a community, information or experiences that can come up that are more of a private or a community only sense that I've become aware of. And that's why all the videos are checked by people who are participating in the programs to make sure that nothing private or culturally sensitive or that are just for Indigenous communities is presented to the public. And that's part of the film editing process that I go through, is that I do have that kind of checks being done. And again, we also make sure that when we're dealing with an issue, that it's not, when we're working with a cultural art form, it's not one that is culturally sensitive, and that shouldn't be available to the public. And let's see. Oh, and the question for men or women only, that's an interesting one, because for example, in the past, there were more traditional roles for men and women in Alaska Native communities. I'll give you an example. Carving ivory was pretty much just done by men, but one of the Alaska Native elders that I've worked with for the longest amount of time told me early on in all of my work that it's an Alaska Native tradition to work with the best materials and the best tools and equipment that become available. Ulus, the crescent-shaped knives that people use, those are made out of metal, not out of slate anymore, for example. And in a parallel way, the roles of men and women have changed. A lot of women do more subsistence practices, hunting, fishing, things like that, and not just gathering on the land. So because of that, there's been growing flexibility in terms of the roles of men and women and the kind of work that men and women do. So that's definitely been an interesting part of our program. The ivory carving workshop that I hosted in Nome, Alaska, all the students were women and the teacher was male, and he thought that was terrific. And for the grass bag workshop I held in Quinnahock, one of the students was a man, and that was great to see too. So all these roles are changing. Looks like we have another question. Were there additional complications or new opportunities due to COVID other than the usual closures? I really have to say that I think a lot of people that work in museums and that work in cultural heritage, it's a nonprofit world. It's a grant writing world. All the work that I do is possibly because of the grants that we get, and then donations from local organizations here in Alaska. And because of that, there's a tendency to just try to get the work done and do the best that you can. And sometimes, outreach can have limitations, especially here in Alaska, where travel is so expensive. And a lot of people live in these remote villages where, you have to get on a float plane to get to a commercial plane, to get on another plane to get to Anchorage. Or if I work in a village, it's the same thing. And some places don't have hotels. So travel can eat up a lot of budget, and people live full lives. And often people don't necessarily have the time in their life to practice their heritage arts until later in life. But later in life, you often have a full-time job. So all of these things get to a place where, because of COVID, I started to just tackle that extra work of doing more work online. For example, I worked with Tsimshian master artist John Hudson to host online carving workshops for carving Southeast style whistles. And I found extra funding through the Sea Alaska Heritage Organization, the Sea Alaska Heritage Institute, to put together kits to send students. And we did that workshop online, and I flexed my hours to work on evenings and weekends to make it more accessible to students. And I think the long story short of that was that what I mentioned at the end of my presentation was that, even though I live in Alaska and I'm working in Alaska, Alaska Native communities are far flung. And certainly for people working in museums, they have collections around the world. And the comfort people have had to develop working online during COVID has opened new opportunities to engage more people in outreach and to include more people in programs and in workshops. So moving forward now, not only have we expanded from workshops in Anchorage, where more than half the Alaska Native population live, we expanded to workshops in villages. But now we're going to make sure that we continue to expand to always have offerings available online as much as possible, because again, that allows more people and further places to really benefit from the kind of museum research and fieldwork that we do. And with that, I see that I only have 1 minute left, so I just wanted to thank you for joining this session, and thank you to the Digitization Conference for letting me join in all the way here from Alaska. Thank you.